Oh dear. Okay, well, I think it would have been probably better to wait to sign up for lunch, but we'll try to find the most equitable way out of it as soon as we go down to the workshop proper. Well, very, very fast. Who knows what time it is, so I'll go as fast as I can.
It's 11.
Well, you already saw this, so you can go away. You can get down and work on the Camex or something like that. 11:15?
I've got 10 of 11.
10 of 11, okay. So we'll try to go fairly fast. Okay. My career's been segmented in some curious set of ways that keeps moving along as a funny window on new ideas and technologies. I first went to art school and trained both as a teacher and as a graphic designer, and spent a couple of a few very unpleasant for me, months in advertising areas in New York City. Went back and taught, so I've had a kind of love-hate relationship over the years with both education and the field of graphic design, and I've done both over the years. So it explains some of my schizophrenia. The first job that was substantial that I ever had was at the Office of Publications at MIT, and it was the very first time that I believe any institution such as a university had developed a design program deliberately and committed itself to it. It was on the tail end of the people who had come from the Bauhaus and spread out into the United States and begun to think very positively and almost in a utopian fashion about what design could do for the universe. And I was sort of the tail end of that. My training was in fact focused on a lot of those ideas, and in some peculiar ways that hasn't gone away. It's been modified a lot, but this relationship of society and design and technology has been, and education have been threads through my life for a long time. So I spent about 7 years dealing with a lot of interesting ideas of science and technology at MIT and expressing them through graphics. So it gave me a kind of base of activity that was very powerful, and always dealing in some fashion with what visual thinking had to do with other kinds of thinking. So I left there and got a Fulbright and went to Italy, which also had a rather strong effect on me, even though I spent a good deal of it in bed with hepatitis. When most people ask me what I did in Italy, I said I spent it in bed. But I did a lot of drawing. I picked up photography because it was an easy way to deal with things. And, exposure to another culture is always very impressive. And this was very shortly after WW2. And so it had a lot of interesting ramifications. I came back and decided to start my own studio, which I did again for another 7 years. It's a little bit like the tales of a locust. And I got to the point where I was supporting a staff and running around and trying to deal with clients, and found that education and dialogue or you do it my way or I'm not going to be happy, came into play a lot. I mean, there's a kind of difficulty between client understanding of what I understood to be graphics and what they needed and what they understood to be what they needed from me. So that's another kind of major issue which I think has become more and more interesting and more relevant to me as a result of what we're in now, which is this computer interaction and interfaces, and we can talk about it a little bit later. But The fact is that instead of discussing and finding out how we might best communicate, we were in this kind of confrontation situation more often than not. If you don't like what I do, then you don't understand. And it was a non-negotiable situation often. Anyway, my solution to it at the time was to go to the MIT Press, which had just begun as a rather substantial organization. And they had gone from, 6 books to 60 in the space of a year and a half with a new director. And I thought that would be a really interesting place for me to work, because it had almost everything. It had advertising, it had the marketing, it had the product, and I wouldn't have to deal with a client over and over again and as I told somebody last night, try to convince them that ragged right was really okay on a caption. So I thought I'd have more control, but the fact is it wasn't all that terrific either. One can't help but wonder, what is going on. I dealt a lot with authors who had, in fact, as they'd written their books in their corner somewhere, and they weren't all that, they were writing on sanitary engineering, or they were writing on political science. MIT Press is not the softest of places as far as the humanities are concerned, but I found that they were visualizing their book as they were writing it, and by the time they came to me, or to my group, that they were very, very clear about how it should be. And so they had this kind of visualization which was very intimate. And there's no way in hell that I could enter into what they had thought. And neither could they enter into the way I was dealing with things. And I'm sort of harping on this issue because I think that it's something that the technology in some interesting way may well change in the future. At least the options for that changing are here. Anyway, a lot of interesting things happened. I dealt with systems, which I enjoyed a great deal. I got very heavily into trying to get computer composition into the environment very fast. I was terrifically impressed by the fact that production modes influenced how you thought and how you could produce anything, and that you had to deal with the specialization of languages between yourself, the author on one hand, or whoever, the marketing manager on another hand, and the typographer and the typesetter and whatever mode of production you're in. It doesn't matter if it's print or not. You must understand each other in some peculiar fashion, and you're handing instructions in effect on as you go, and the worst thing you can ever do is stand at the printing press, for example, and say, which I have done, how about a little more red? It really doesn't look good. And I used to do that way back when I first worked at MIT, because we had this, it was a very pivotal experience. The printing press and service for MIT was in the basement of my office. And we had a contract to do printing with them. So I would run down there with my mechanicals in 60 pieces, and talk to the foreman, who I made a really good friendship with. And one day I kept saying, more ink, more ink, more ink, and I was learning. And the next day, all the press sheets were stuck together in a solid mass. So you learn the hard way. Anyway, I got at the press. It was very interesting to develop a whole set of systems for things which needed systems, and really sort of erratic, idiosyncratic responses to a lot of illustrated books. And of course there were jackets, so a lot of things. So at one point I thought it would be marvelous to be able to have a small R&D, a mini lab in the place, so that while you were working and dealing with the production modes, you would be experimenting with new ones and be able to absorb the technologies as they came in the environment. And it would not be that you had to work and be limited, and then go home and work on something that you really like to do, so that that you might meld better. Well, that was a great idea, and we got Tom Norton, who you will meet later, with his 3M color on color machine, which was the first sort of dry color copier developed by 3M, into the press. And we had a little research component for about 6 months. And that was in the 60s, and then suddenly all the budgets went down like that, and one of the first things to go was, of course, the experimental stuff. So around that time, Tom Norton introduced me to Ron McNeil, right, who had a printing press over at the architecture department. And one thing led to another. And we ended up with the 3M machine and Tom in a closet, and Ron and I teaching a course together called Messages and Means about 7 years ago, maybe, thereabouts. And it was terrific, because the printing press that Ron had brought in piece by piece to what was formerly an architecture professor's office, which was maybe, I don't know, how big is it? Maybe as big as the ladies' room down here. And we had, I don't know, 12 students, and we were using the press interactively. And we had them do, and you'll see some of the stuff around, I guess the negative out here is one of the results of that. They just all, and none of them were designers. None of them were really visual people to begin with. And they did a direct plate, put it on the press within a half hour, practically, and then we started applying ink in varying ways, and they would get up there and add a red, and as the rollers went around, they would see what the red did to something, and we run off the presses, the prints, and they would run off and squirrel them somewhere, and there was this huge, it was our ooh-ah period, gee whiz, wow period, and everybody collected enormous, I mean, God, talk about thick ink. I mean, silver ink was our number at the time. But we did wonderful prints, and it was a very vital time, and we're well out of it at this point, but it taught us a whole lot. And in fact, that idea of instant visualization, of affecting the production tool or the reproduction tool, being able to respond back to the tool very fast. Oh, it's too red. Oh, it's too green. All of that sort of comes from all the frustrations of having dealt professionally. But more important, I think we feel, and I guess you're here for the same reason, that the new tools are going to, if they're in some way controlled or understood by the users, can become as interactive as these cruder things that we've described, and that we hope that that's one of the things that you're going to experience. So the idea of typesetters, for example, on your desk, right, simply makes it, if you're dealing with setting of type, gives you a kind of control that you haven't had since you were a medieval monk. Okay. Anyways, that's about what my slides tend to be about, and that's what the workshop is essentially about. The other component of it is that the idea of specialization tends to breed, I think, solutions which tend not to change or be as interactive as they might be with the real communication problem. And to that end, we figure in the workshop that people who make print in any fashion share a great amount of concern with the tools and can give a whole lot of language back and forth to each other. And to that end, we have photographers and printmakers, and you will meet and talk with them, and I'm sure some of you do the same on your own, so that anybody who's concerned with graphics, with the design process or the visual communication aspect, and with the reproduction tools, hopefully comes together here. Okay, and that's the new scene. So let's. I'll run through fast.
Just clip that thing a little higher. We're getting
Higher? Mumbly, is it?
Well,
It's just as well. There. Okay, I'm flailing. Will that work, do you think? I don't know. Let's try it. All right. So, I think it's sometimes easy to forget how very primary things are, and that most of the very complex cultural and social and political communication that we've dealt with over the years and evolved with have to do with the human scale and with our very human needs and with the ideas of survival. Do you think we could get less light in here? Thank you. Anything we perceive or feel or need to communicate comes from some very, very basic and primary needs. And our senses and our feelings are the thing that we tend to use as the touchstone for everything more sophisticated. In a one-to-one relationship, the immediate senses, even in this group, we're reading body language, we're smelling, we're feeling, we're touching. We're doing all those wonderful things that we have the capacity to do with our bodies. However, in the more sophisticated evolution of complex cultures, we have learned how to communicate through time and through space. And one of the most significant, and still I guess the primary, I think it still constitutes 80% of our communication, is print. Now, print is being very seriously challenged at this point, and all the wonderful things that the Industrial Revolution gave us, and the amount of printed materials inundate us. We have a hard time dealing with it. And print has imposed, as have the kind of physical, mechanical, industrial transmissions of those messages, have imposed a kind of tyranny and a peculiar set of constraints on us. Right? The relationship of graphics enables you to, in effect, replace the human presence. And there are points at which there's a kind of fade in, fade out. You know, there's a kind of real intimate relationship of your message to the participants of the discussion or the dialogue. It's not large-scale communication. It's small and it's personal. I liken these kinds of graphics to village square communications. The people are still present in some fashion. The personalization is still there. Well, the larger scale you get, the further you go from it. There's a certain amount of interaction possible while you're at this level. You can't affect it, right? You know your community, and it's local and it's responsive. You put up a thing about your piano that you want to sell with little tags and your telephone number on it, and more likely somebody tears it off and calls you if they're interested in a piano. If not, forget it. This stabilizes and makes the interaction very, very different. The markets, the relationships are primarily on the basis of consumer interest. They're also an intellectual level, but this is rigid. Once it's frozen, that's it. Right? I get it, you read it, and I almost never will meet the person who put this together. What I know then is a kind of corporate level of communication. I think, I'm not sure why, oh dear me. This is just a little case study of a poster. It should have preceded this. A poster done by my friend Jackie Casey on the left for an MIT concert. MIT is a very interesting place because it is a communication cosmos. It is a kind of community which has a certain amount of flux, although print is used as part of the communication method. If you see this element by itself in the office, it is looked upon as a piece of design. Right? If you see it in the environment over here, it is another piece of information which is simply added on to an ongoing group of pieces of information. It's very much as if this, right, were an element in this. It's become static. Here it's sort of interactive. With the advent, then you go out into the larger areas of magazines and books, which are the kind of newspapers, magazines, and books, which are the collection of a lot of interested segments of material in print. The natural result on the left is the storage and the physical space which print takes up, which is a repository for all the stuff. On your right, you have the famous video disc, which represents an incredible kind of new storage, which is probably the successor to things like microfiche, in part videotape, slides, etc. Other ways of storing and collecting and accessing information on either a short-term or a long-term level. On your left are a lot of videotape games. Here's some more videotape stuff. The ways of dealing with information are changing radically. The ideas of transmission and the live presence of people relating to each other are rather suspect at this point. I visited this video store on the left, and I'm sure all of you have been into one by now, and they're more or less complex. But they offer this weird combination of live and non-live or real-time and sort of repeat performance situations, so that you don't know what real life is anymore. And if you sit at home, sometimes if you're a video watcher like I am, or a TV watcher, you don't know whether it really is happening or whether it happened. And so the whole sense of reality and the kind of transmission is up for grabs. And it's a whole other issue which print doesn't deal with. On your right is a control room that belongs to Super Friends. Does anybody watch animated cartoons on Saturday? No. I find that the future of the world is, for me, expressed in some of these high sci-fi animated cartoons on Saturday morning. It's very interesting what they stress. This control room looks not unlike the control room, I don't mean to make it as high sci, of the architecture machine, which is a place that you'll visit tomorrow very briefly. In this place, a great deal of information is being managed through computerization or through computation, and this is the control video switching environment on the left, and on your right is a room they call the media room. And what's happening here, if you can see, is that there's a large-scale rear projection screen which is giving you visual data areas. And it's an older project of theirs called Spatial Data Management System. And what it is a huge visual filing system. And what you're able to do is access on your left is a kind of map of the situation. You've picked an area, it expresses itself through rear view projection. It's all in the computer now, onto this screen. And on your right is some further detail. I think on your right is something like a telephone book. And you access it, you'll see this tomorrow, by I don't know if you're still using joysticks to do it, but you can pick a person's name and point to it, and the telephone number comes on. It dials with sound, and you get the person responding to it. So the whole presence of, where we started at the beginning, of senses is being established in a surrogate fashion. For the first time, you're back able to have a whole variety of graphics, photography, computational environment, sound. What else? Have we got smell yet? Maybe a little bit. Sound, smell. Is there more, Ron? Did I miss anything? No. Yeah, there's at least 100 other sensorial things. Anyway, this human interface for the computer is an area which will be developed more and more. And in effect, what you've done is come full circle, and you've sent signals rather than people. Or you will have done that, or you have the option to. And the whole change over into an informational society also has implicit the ability to send not just messages, but the implications and the senses of people. So print used to be the only way of transmitting, and it certainly is no longer, since we gave up smoke signals and tom-toms. I think they were sort of good. Well, office machines, as a part of this revolution, provide people with communication tools and publishing tools that they never had before. It isn't just that you have a fast copy in the office or a word processing system. People who never had access to communication tools or information systems now can get at them. They're cheaper, they're easier, and that has to mean something to this relationship of authorship, which has a great deal to do with what graphic design has been all about. And so one has to understand that not only are the tools extremely instant and enabling for you to visualize a lot of stuff, but it's a part of a revolution which is putting information tools into other people's hands and questioning what's happening to specializations and professions. This is a computer show which was here this last year in Boston, and I like the kind of ad hoc little sign about how you get to an Apple computer. But I heard from the people at the Xerox booth that 2 years ago there had been almost an empty show, and that this year you could barely get through. And the interest in home computers and home electronics and video games is just enormous. I don't know what it's really about, but I think it's very, very serious. A lot of people are going to try to find out what it's all about. So kids are beginning with stuff at home, and the next language that one will learn, along with English and a couple of foreign languages, will be some sort of computer languages in grammar school. I'm convinced of it. And you will have a generation of people who will have an incredible access to a huge set of visual and sensorial and communication tools that they never had before. Aha. And there they are. Well, what are graphics all about? What has technology done to, what has the medium done to the message? It's very clear that levels of communication have been very complex. They began to get, and they were in fact rather idiosyncratic, and then they began to get more and more standardized in order to reach more and more people. There's a real ratio, I think, between standardization of stuff and the number of people, or at least there has been, the number of people that you can reach. Once we began to send stuff around on paper, in effect, the knowledge industry began, one might say that, and it's been a long time coming. From what I remember, print, movable type was invented way before it was ever used, and Gutenberg just happened to be at the right time in the right place. And one of the things they were waiting for was the ability to manufacture paper and move it around. So the technology has had an enormous amount to do with it. Prior to the 19th and 20th century, there was a certain amount of holistic doing of books. Right? On the left, there may not have been a hell of a lot of originality to the manuscript, to be sure, but in fact there was an awful lot of craft and an awful lot of holistic production. So the person who wrote decorated, and I take it that they made the paper nearby, and there was a real relationship to how the product was developed. And it began to break down gradually as it began to get mechanized. And ultimately, this is what a lot of people are afraid of, right? What is going to happen to the book? Well, the classic answer is the book is the best random access tool yet available. So fear not. Some of the modes are the carriers of the information, right? Very, very different in their quality. The difference between engravers' tools and the offset dot represent a great deal of possible change for the way in which the message was transmitted and how it was achieved. And therefore, they feed each other back and forth. I don't want to sound like a McLuhanite, but on the other hand, photography enabled an enormous amount of change. Within 2 or 3 years, they started dealing. Book publishing is one of the most notoriously conservative in the best and the worst sense of the term. But they began to get into photography, and this will tell you how long ago it was. But then you could place anything anywhere because it was photographic. And if offset was that flexible, what is electronic organization all about? So, from the halftone dot and full color to the video screen is really where we're at right now, and it is a very pivotal edge. The tools are different, and really, therefore, the message making in some fashion may well be different, and that's one of the things that we have this great challenge and opportunity to look at. What's going to happen to typefaces when the people sitting down at a terminal say, I can do this just like traditional italics for you. And I say, what is traditional italics? And he says, you just add a 30-degree slant. Now, anybody who's in typography remembers, maybe none of you do, when an italic letter was cut individually, and it was a separate thing. Well, you can compute that. You can compute it forwards, you can compute it backwards, you can make it thicker, you can make it thinner. You could probably, in the very near future, as some people are doing now, devise your own alphabet. There's absolutely nothing to stop my author, right, who is visualizing his or her book while writing, to have it visualized. It's entirely possible. And what then happens to the person who knows an awful lot about visual communication in words and images? Which is you guys. Well, symbology here. It's very easy to see how graphic some of our language was originally. The relationship of words to images has been a peculiar and interesting thing. The practice of the professions has pretty much been to separate the person who was the typographer and the designer of type away from the maker of images. This is unusual. In fact, only in comic strips until very, very recently has the combination of images and words been together. And yet, in fact, verbal and visual activity is very much a part of the human frame. Only in the pursuit, in the latter part in this century, I think, has the practice of making image quality out of words to express the voice of the transmitter been the province of really advertising and information and message making. It certainly hasn't been a part of art, although, at some point, witness this thing, the messages were very clearly a part of the image. So it's taken a whole other framework. Again, the expressiveness of typography is emotive. It's sort of it's making you feel something that you didn't hear or really see. Okay? Whoever did this is long gone, but there's a voice about it that has a kind of expressive quality that is very different from a more highly informational typography. So you have this range of objective to subjective information that you're transmitting. Again, the relationship between the hard and the soft, in this case, in the photographic thing. This is one of the early fast participatory typography things that Ron and I did with non-visual and non-design students. And what happened was they printed this and folded up into little books. But it's very, very flexible. On the left is an early print taken off of Ron McNeil's plotter, which you'll see working on I hope, on a much more sophisticated level. And it is a picture, in effect, of this. Right? On your right is an old computer printout of little dot matrices, which is another form for expressing verbal material. And here is a 2-bit font that was developed by a graphic designer named Wendy Richmond, who some of you may have met last night, with a guy from the architecture machine who was a programmer, I guess really a computer scientist at this point. And the interest here was to be able to transmit typography with some reasonable quality. The technology of the screen makes it very difficult to do anything that has the kind of continuous sort of analog quality of a reproduction proof, or even of a photographic proof. So, yet you are able to begin to visualize on the video screen with a lot of interesting flexibility. So one of the real issues in the future, or at least in the next few years, will be how you deal with this ability to visualize type in a digital form with all the computational flexibility at the screen. On one level, I'm terribly interested in it as a professional design tool, which will enable you to do an incredible amount of visualizing fast before you ever get to hard copy at all. And also as a kind of arena of conversation with clients, so that, for instance, if you don't like it this way, let's try it another way, so that there are so many rapid changes possible with computers that you are able to visualize something that might have taken you 3 weeks to redefine. So maybe many of you who work with clients understand too well this problem of, I've made 3 rough drafts of what this is about, and they don't like any of them, and I got to go back and do some more. Well, the one way of dealing that was always to charge them more, right? And the time was such a problem that you couldn't change it anyway. So it was a very good way of expressing your graphic concerns and maintaining them. With an arena of discussion which is graphic and visual that you could share, and you could even share across the country in the future, it will make life very different and very difficult in some ways and very interesting in others. So I submit that the technology is going to really change the mode of thinking, and that those people who are sensitive to it and really willing to explore it will be, in fact, the change agents and the leaders of a new graphic environment. And that the process will become more important, that the educational aspect will become more important, and that the pursuit of quality in this kind of shared graphic and visual environment is going to be very interesting and very difficult. So these are a few sort of crude modifications of our first type. This is what's called a 2-bit font. Let's see, have I got it right? It's 8 levels of gray? Ron? 4. Jesus, thank you. Anyway, this one is 8 bits. 256. I keep learning it and forgetting it. Talk about schizophrenia. Anyway, this is very interesting. This is our Bedoni brute force, which you'll have a little bit to do with down there. It's just been digitized in. It's aligned better than you see it now. There are not very many editing capacities for it. But if you compare this with a green screen like they have on the Omnitech, I'm very interested in how you respond to the ability to see what you do immediately in type. It questions the whole idea of who writes and who sets type. So here again we have the video disc, which is an incredible medium which has something like 58,000 frames, which are highly resolved, and which in fact can become a book, and I guess has. I have not seen the Sears Roebuck catalog, which is on video disc. Has anybody here? Anyway, they've done that, and it's, its use is obvious on that score, and it raises a lot of very interesting graphic design questions as to how you get the material to the disc and how you organize it, and the catalog is clearly not very interactive. We're hoping to get a disc that we haven't seen yet called who's the Kids disc. And apparently whoever designed it, I think it's a disc company, I don't know whether it's Warner or who, Pioneer, I think. And it plays games, which use all the potential, or at least a lot of the potential, without computer backup, of the disc. How many of you have fooled with a disc at all? Couple of you. Well, you should play with the one that we have down there and get an idea of the kinds of things you can do. You can scan fast, forward, back. You can do single frame. You can modify the speed. You can, I don't think you can pick too many. You can pick frames, and you can, in fact, not with this one, but with a more complex control, pick a number of frames out of the disk and then simply run them off as a new sequence. So there's a whole lot of very interesting things that no other medium has allowed you to deal with in such a direct fashion. You can pixelate, you can take one frame slow and read it, in effect. So it's a whole new medium of transmitting all sorts of information, static as well as dynamic, animated and film, all sorts of sound possibilities. And they're very complicated to prepare at this point. And one of the big areas of future development is in the write once disks, where you would be able to compile your own database, in effect, which was either visual or graphic or verbal or whatever. So that's one of the major changes. These are the old traditional forms. You all know them. The mountains of material that are on paper that you have to pull from in order to take a thing which is holistically conceived in the first place. You have to break it down under present specialization of print and separate every aspect of it, sort of articulate it and organize it and bring it all back together again in packages so that it can be brought out in one complete package again. It's very complex. It's an enormous amount of material. There are already tools on the market which begin to use electronic means for doing this kind of thing. So instead of doing the photographic process, this is an electronic process camera. You lay your thing down very much as you would on a Xerox rather. And it will enlarge, reduce, put screens in, distort. You can read in widths and lengths and redefine it with production quality. Anybody used one? No. Well, you'll get a look at one, I think, tomorrow. We should have one ourselves. We don't. Graphics becomes suddenly very interesting to industry and to corporation communication, and there is a proliferation of this kind of simple color graphic terminals. And they have little programs in them that deal with what most of you, anybody who has done a corporation or an annual report understands, which is that if you express figures, statistics, graphically, they are much clearer and can be much more misleading, in fact, if you so desire. So these terminals, and witness that IBM is interested in this market, have something like 16 colors, and they have a number of predetermined graphic programs which you feed the statistics in and they come out in some sort of color simplified form, pie charts, bar graphs, this kind of thing. So an enormous amount of graphic decision making has already been made. People in the industry and in corporation at decision making levels are using these for overhead charts, for slides, for sales presentations, for a whole lot of things. So, the fact that this is going to be available as compared to magic markers or somebody like you generating the graphics for these people is a very significant change. These are some of the layout and newspaper, mostly developed for newspaper systems, which have to do with a small degree of interaction. Usually they are found at the production point where you have made a layout and somebody else takes that layout and does all the kind of combination of bringing in the type, bringing in the images, and getting them together and then putting them out to film or to paper. They are more or less complex, and most of the systems, as you see on the left, are very much like the Camex that we have down here, the big interactive layout system. They're not in color, they're all linear, and they tend, with the exception of the new III system, to simply represent schematically type and images. The system that I've showed you before that we have down in the workshop, on the full color one, allows you to see everything potentially as it would be, which is very different from seeing just a green line on a screen or even on a black and white one. So they're going all the way to plate making. The holographic arts industry is in a serious change mode. And in fact, it's not at all clear how long it will stay that way. And I'm really sort of missing a couple of slides here, but while it's going through the traditional print mode, the area of video text, which bypasses print completely and maybe in the future would have some sort of proofing or on-demand device that you could get out of your home, is becoming a new industry. It's really different. And we'll be talking about that Thursday. We'll have some people coming in who deal both with cable transmission and how you'll be able to access information at home rather than having to buy a magazine or subscribe to a newspaper. What happens to advertising when it's all sent in soft form is a very interesting question, and it's totally unclear how it's going to work out. The possibility of you sitting down and making your own book out of piles of information data systems and running it off at your own little proofing device at home is really almost here. I mean, the technologies are here, it's complex to work it out, but it's just a whole other world. And my own guess is that things like print will continue on in a modified form, just as radio continues along with television, but that there are going to be an enormous number of changes, and possibly, well, the microphone's getting, it's all right. Possibly those changes will have a serious effect on the practice of the old profession of graphic design. Now, I think basically that's all The rest of this material is just a little reprise on what's happened to different kinds of intentions. You know, the message is really, yes, modified by the medium, but the message is modified by the human need. And it is more or less profound. And frequently they look alike, but one can usually tell the difference between a serious, well-intentioned human gesture in print as compared to one that is designed simply to sell a product, although it's not entirely clear sometimes. But those modes are ones that we personally, as visual artists or graphic artists, work very hard to maintain in ourselves and in our work. And finally, it's the quality that makes the difference, I think, of intention. And no matter what tools you're using, because ultimately you're back to your own head. Huh? So I guess that I can stop there.